Hello, I'm Ian. Welcome to my workshop and to the third part in this introductory series, which will be on sharpening. So this is my block plane. It's getting a little bit dull, so I'll take the iron out and give it a sharpen. It's the same process that I use for my plane irons and my chisels. And then afterwards we'll put it back together again and we'll do a few test cuts and I'll show you how it should perform. Now I don't normally sharpen on my bench. This is really just for the benefit of the camera. I have a dedicated sharpening station in the corner. And the process I use is extremely easy. It requires almost no skill whatsoever, a little bit of technique, but there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get exactly the same levels of sharpness that I can achieve. The processes I use are really designed for Western style chisels and plane irons. So for Japanese tools, I don't have any experience of those, so the metals are slightly different and their sharpening procedures are slightly different. So this is really just for Western style tools. So as a hand tool woodworker, there are really only two criteria I have when choosing my preferred sharpening method. The first is that the sharpening results need to be sharp enough to do the job, and the second, and most importantly, is that they produce consistent angles. So when I started decades ago, I had a brief dalliance with freehand sharpening, but the results were frankly diabolical. I could never get exactly the same angle twice, and particularly with narrow chisels, when you're pulling it back to try and meet this angle, any slight wiggle left to right and the corners have pretty much gone instantly, which then limits the use of the tool for cleaning out, particularly the corners of dovetails or that sort of thing. It's very easy to get the blades and the irons very, very sharp, but the consistency was hopeless. So I would urge you to invest in some honing guides, get the job done, and then spend your time practicing with the tool and learning to use and enjoy the tool properly. And like all of my plane irons and all of my chisels, it has two bevel angles on the end, and I'll talk about the actual angles in a moment. But this large surface here is our primary bevel, and the purpose of that is simply to remove as much material relatively quickly at a lower angle than our cutting edge. So the little stripe at the very end, a little fingernail, that's our cutting edge, which is a slightly higher angle than the primary bevel. So this secondary angle, the cutting edge, is the one that I'll work through all the grits and spend some time on until we get to a mirror polish. But the quality of cut is only determined by the quality of polish on this face and the quality of polish on the meeting face, which is on the back of the iron. So if you look at the reflection back here from my pencil, you can see it's quite dull. You can probably just about make out the original manufacturer's grinding marks. But if I bring the pen down to the front towards the cutting, to the actual cutting edge, you can see that it's a mirror polish. Now for a plane iron, you only really need to work sort of the end quarter to work that to a mirror polish. This area up here never comes in contact with the work. But for chisels, at exactly the same bevel angles as the plane irons, but the backs are worked to a mirror polish along the entirety of the back of the chisel. So there are no hollows in here, there are no grinder marks, it's a mirror polish all the way along the entire flat coplanar surface. And you'll see the importance of that as we work our way through the projects, particularly for pairing. So angles. Now the angle that you actually grind your cutting edge to is determined by the level of the hardness of the wood you intend to work. So there is an international scale called the Janka scale, where they take a steel ball bearing, it's a little under 12 millimeters, and they push it until it is halfway buried down into a piece of wood. And the amount of force that was required to bury that ball bearing is measured, and that is recorded on a thing called the Janka scale. So if you are living in Japan, which is covered in Japanese cedar, which is a very soft wood, that is somewhere around the 300, 400 scale on the Janka scale, so it's right at the bottom. So your cutting angle of your edge tools is going to be ground at something like 20, 25 degrees to work a very soft wood. It's a very pointy, sharp, slicing cut. If on the other hand you are in Brazil or Africa, where they have very dense, slow-growing hardwoods, they are right at the other end of the scale. So they're in the thousands, 3,000, 4,000. So they're incredibly hard. If you were to use a tool ground at 20 degrees on a piece of Brazilian hardwood, it is just going to crumble. There is literally not enough metal behind that cutting edge supporting it, and it will just crumble away. So you're likely to need your cutting edge ground to a much steeper angle, which is more of a scraping cut, something in the 45, 50, 55 degrees, or perhaps even steeper mark. Now you'll find it harder to push your tool through the workpiece because you're really just scraping it along, but there is, because it's a less steep angle, there is much more material behind that cutting edge supporting it, so it won't crumble away and you'll have better edge retention. Now I live and work in England. I use English hardwoods, native English hardwoods, some European hardwoods, and occasionally some imported North American hardwoods. And they all fall around the sort of 800 to perhaps 1800, so midway along that Janka scale. So I grind my primary bevel to 25 degrees and the secondary bevel, the actual cutting edge, to 30 degrees. Now I've never found a wood that I'm not been able to plane successfully. Now if you're using fiddleback or sort of a rippled finish timber, so anything that has a crazy grain pattern, lots of interlocking grain, you might find that a slightly steeper angle is beneficial to prevent you getting what's called tear out, or you just use the tool in a slightly different way. So if I was to push this tool straight through the workpiece, it'll be at a 30 degrees. If I were to turn it slightly and push it at a skewed angle, the very action of doing that has effectively presented the cutting edge at a slightly steeper angle. So if I'm working a piece of wood and I'm perhaps find an area where I'm getting slightly tear out, or there's knots or anything that's giving me a little bit of grief, then that simple turning that tool to a more of a skewed angle while I'm working that particular area will more often than not easily cut through the wood and produce the finish that I expect. So 30 degrees is what I'll be sharpening this to. Okay, so onto the actual kit. So for the plain irons, I use a Veritas Mark II honing guide. This comes with this projection jig, which fits on the side or the end, and that allows you to set the projection consistently for your edge tools, either 25 or 30 degrees, depending on what I'm doing. It does have this eccentric roller which you can adjust, which effectively raises or lowers the jig, creating a micro bevel, but I don't bother with that. I leave the roller set as it is and just change the projection on the actual setting jig. I've had this for 20 odd years. I really like it. It's never really failed me, and it always produces consistent results, which is what I'm after. For chisels, I use a Richard Kell honing guide. This goes from about this width, which is still wider than my widest chisel, and it can close up down to 0. So it'll easily and very securely hold even my narrowest chisel, which is 1/8 of an inch, which is about 3 mil. This is used along with a stop block. So this I made, and it's calibrated for the various levels of projection depending on what angles I want. So the wheels go up beside it. I push the tool through until it hits the edge of the stop block, nip it up, and off you go. For the actual cutting, I have 3 water stones. So So these two are combination stones, have 2 grits, and that's a single grit stone. So they go from 1,000, 3, 6, 8 and 10,000 grit. So they do the actual cutting of the edge. I have a strop block. Now I'm not a big fan of leather. I find they're very easy to very quickly crown an edge and put curves on the underside of your tools. So I prefer to use this as it's very hard. This is 36mm ply, which is effectively 2 18mm boards glued together. And I use a little bit of metal polish, dab that onto the top, a few little spots, add some white spirit, create a bit of a slurry, a bit of a paste, and that does the final polishing, the final cut on the edge tools to create that mirrored finish. Now this, I understand, is something like a 20,000 grit, so it's a very fine abrasive compound. So the stones do the cutting, but to calibrate them they need to be flatted. So to flat them I use a piece of float glass. So this is float glass, it's 600mm wide, 300mm deep, and it's 12mm thick, and that is plenty wide enough for 2 pieces of standard sized wet and dry. So they're 400 grit and they're used to flatten and therefore calibrate the stones. On the other side I have 2 pieces of very aggressive grits, so they are 60 grit and 120 grit, and they are used to create the primary bevel. So that initial material removal is done very quickly with these aggressive cuts. It leaves a horrible finish, a very scored scratch pattern, but that's immaterial because all I'm interested in is removing material so I can then work on the cutting edge. And that is done exactly the same in the honing guide, set at 25 degrees and create that primary bevel. I also have this Nagura stone, which is a very hard stone. It's harder than all of these, and this is used to create a slurry on the very finest grits, so the yellow ones. And I'll show you that in a moment. So this is the iron from the block plane, and as you can see, the secondary bevel, this actual cutting edge, is still very narrow. It's a very skinny fingernail on the end of the iron. When that, through subsequent sharpenings, that gets deeper and deeper and creeps into the primary bevel. Now when it gets to about 1/3 of the way up, then I'll go back and redress the primary bevel, the 25 degrees, take that almost to the very edge, and then put a new 30-degree secondary bevel on it. But for the moment, because that's still very skinny, I only need to set the tool for 30 degrees on the projection on the honing guide and put a new secondary bevel cutting edge on it. Okay, so assemble the honing guide, set to 30 degrees projection for that secondary bevel, put the iron in. Now I'm just demonstrating this particular guide, but they all work in pretty much the same way. Nip that up, make sure it's nice and level. And that's it. So that should now be completely parallel with our roller and set for a 30-degree projection. First 2 stones are the 1000 and 3000. A bit of water on those. Now I know these are flat because I just pulled them out of the water and they don't go in there unless they're flatted. So I'll put a little grind on there. Use the whole width of the stone. And all I'm trying to do is put a new grind on until I can feel a slight burr on the back. When I can feel a burr, then I've definitely worked that edge. So I know that I've ground until I've created a new, gone right to that edge. If I couldn't feel a burr, then I haven't quite reached the edge yet, and there's still a curve on the end. We're not quite there yet. A few more strokes with that. And there it is. You can just hear that little catch, a little burr on that end. Then the subsequent grits, all they're doing is refining that scratch pattern. So at the moment that's quite a coarse scratch pattern. I just need to refine that and take it back until we end up with the polish, and then put a mirror polish on it. So I'm not concentrating on taking much more metal off. I don't want to waste my edge. Just a few more strokes, still feel the burr, and just refine that edge. Flat this, put a crisscross pattern on it. Work these on the float glass. All flat, all gone. If you do it regularly, after every use, you'll maintain their flatness. Yeah, all gone. So that was the 1 and the 3. Now we want the 6 and the 8,000 grits. Now at this point you can use the Ngura stone. So these are flat, and what this does, it doesn't re-flatten them, but it just redresses that surface and creates a little slurry, a little mud, and it's that does the cutting. So you can see this little sort of paste, if you like. That's the abrasive which will do the cut. I don't really need to use this. I'll only generally use this when I'm doing multiples, but I'll just demonstrate. Now use that to keep dressing that edge. And at this point I'm just pulling the tool. I'm just trying to literally draw out that metal from the edge. I don't want to work it back and forth. I'm just going to pull that back and draw the metal out to a fine point. Still working it left to right, using all of the width of the stone. Clean that off, go to the next one. Pull back, elevate, push forwards, pull back. And the little dark patches, these streaks, and that's the metal that's coming off. Now you can sometimes find that the actual burr, because this is getting finer and finer, it literally works its way off. You create what's called a wire edge, and that little fine piece of metal ends up on the end of one of your stones, which literally just fallen off. But I can just feel it there still. So that was enough on that. And lastly, the 10,000 grit, the Ngura stone. Pull that edge. Bit more water on that. I normally do this at my sharpening station, where I've got a little water dropper which drops water on it continuously. So pull that back, create that polished edge, and that by now will be on a very fine polished edge, and I can only just feel the burr, which is really a thin piece of metal. I'm actually walking back and forwards. Dry that off a bit, and then on to the compound. Dab some of the metal polish on it, a little bit of white spirit, create this little paste, and then I only want a few strokes on this because this is relatively, I mean it's hard, but it's actually relatively soft as it's just a piece of wood. You can easily crown an edge, which is where, as I'm pulling it, you actually cut on the top side as well, so you can put a crowned edge on there, and we don't want that. So 4 strokes is plenty enough for that. Get a different cloth to take that white spirit off, and now we have an extremely polished beveled edge, and I can't really feel any burr, but if there were a little burr, I could take that off, back to the 10,000 grit. And this is where I just work that polished edge, the back of the iron again. So do a few little strokes on that just to pull that wire edge, anything that might have left with the burr, away. Then onto the polishing compound and redress that mirrored surface. And that's it. And what you should see is when you look at the back of your iron, you see a completely even scratch pattern or mirror, and there's no glinting highlight on it. If there's a slight glinting light, so if you can pick up a little highlight on the edge, then that means the light is hitting it at another face, and effectively you've got another facet on there and not a proper edge. So you haven't just got two surfaces meeting, you've got three. You've got your back, your bevel, and an extra one, and you don't want that. So to achieve a mirror polish on the back of your chisels and plane irons, it's really very simple. When I get a new tool, I'll spend some time flatting it, so I'll work it through all of the grits, 1000 all the way up to 10,000, until I've created a completely flat coplanar surface on the back of the chisel. And that will have gone through up to 10,000 grit. So it's got a very fine scratch pattern, but it's not polished. And then to polish it, I just use the strop block, a little bit of paste, a little bit of white spirit, and literally work that back until it's brought out a mirror shine. Now, how long that takes you to achieve is really dependent on the quality of the chisel that you buy. So for more information on chisels, if you go and look at my first video on getting started, there's a chapter towards the end just on chisels, and I show you a few differences between a quality tool and a budget chisel. For plane irons, it's really pretty much the same. Get a new tool, I'll take the iron out, and I'll go through that same process, working it the whole of the back until I have a completely flat coplanar surface. The only difference being the polishing, I really only concentrate on that last sort of half, third, quarter area, not the whole surface. Now there is another method called the ruler trick, where you'll take a thin ruler, you'll rest it on the edge of your stone, and then you'll put your plane iron on that. Now that has the effect of elevating the back of the iron, which means just the front is resting on the stone, is in contact with the stone, and you'll work that back and forth until you've created a very slight bevel on the very edge, and a little micro bevel that's being flatted and polished on the very edge, and that's all you have to do. Now that's fine, that works well, but I don't really bother with that. It just seems another procedure to go through. So instead I just go through the process when I get a new tool, and then I know it's flat. And then after every polishing or every sharpening, I just have to polish that little back, keeping it flat, and that's how I maintain the flatness of the edge tools. Okay, so here's our freshly prepared iron. I'll put it all back together again. I'll set the iron, so I'm taking a very shallow cut on one end. Just see those shavings in the corner. Same amount of cut in the middle and the same amount of cut at the other end. So I know that the iron is completely perpendicular to the sole. It's not skewed at all. I'm getting a nice even, very light cut. Nip that up, and now we're all set. Good to go. Okay, so now for the fun bit. So I'm not going to waste your time showing you this cutting a piece of paper or shaving myself. Frankly, if I couldn't prepare a tool that's sharp enough to cut paper, then I might as well give up. This is a block plane, and the only real test for a block plane is if it can cut end grain or plain end grain. So this is a piece of cherry, American cherry, And this on that Janka scale is about 800, 850, something like that. So it's on the softer end of hardwoods. It's still a hardwood, but it's towards the softer end of hardwoods. This, however, is a piece of English hornbeam. Now this is pretty much the hardest English native species that there is. This stuff was used for oxen's yokes, so it'd be shaped and it would go on the shoulders of the oxen when they're pulling carts and that sort of thing. And this, on that same scale, is about 1600, 1650, something like that. So it's twice as hard as cherry. Now what we're looking for is that I can plane, or the tool is capable of planing, a continuous shaving that's full length and full width of the cherry, and hopefully of the hornbeam. And if it can do that, then it's certainly sharp enough. Okay, so first up is the cherry. And there you have full length, full width, end grain. Oh, come on. Cherry shavings. Now for the hornbeam. And there you have full length, full width, end grain, hornbeam shavings. So that's the end of the sharpening demonstration. Clearly there's a little bit of skill and practice required to control the block plane in order to create the shavings, but hopefully I've demonstrated that the actual sharpening technique is really very, very easy. With a little bit of practice, there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to get similar results. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please like and subscribe to the channel. Do leave a comment if there's anything you'd like some clarification on. Coming up next will be a video on stock preparation, but I hope you enjoyed that. Hope to see you on the next one, and thank you for your time.